Welcome back to Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston. In today's episode, we're diving into the vital topic of psychological safety in the workplace. I'll explore what it means, why it's essential for success, and how it can be cultivated, especially in environments rife with personal and corporate politics. The concept of psychological safety has gained significant traction in recent years, and for good reason. As our work environments become increasingly complex, diverse, and often politically charged, the need for spaces where people can authentically express themselves without fear has never been more important. We've explored psychological safety briefly in past episodes, such as the one about why meetings suck and how to make them better, but we wanted to do a deeper dive on this topic today. Whether you're a team leader looking to foster innovation, an employee navigating workplace dynamics, or just curious about the psychology behind the positive business impact of effective teamwork, this episode will offer insights that go beyond the buzzwords to explore the deeper psychological foundations of workplace safety. Psychological safety is the belief that you can speak up, take risks, and express your thoughts without fear of punishment or humiliation at work. According to Amy Edmondson, who coined the term, environments with high psychological safety promote better learning and performance outcomes. But the psychological underpinnings of this concept run deeper than just feeling comfortable. From a cognitive psychology perspective, psychological safety reduces cognitive load. When we're not constantly monitoring our environment for threats to our social standing or to our emotions, we free up mental resources for creativity and problem solving. The brain's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, is constantly scanning for social threats. In unsafe environments, this system goes into overdrive, triggering stress responses that inhibit the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for higher order thinking. What many don't realize is that psychological safety operates on a spectrum rather than as a binary state. Research by Google's Project Aristotle found that it was the single most important factor in high-performing teams, but also that it manifests differently across cultural contexts. Japanese teams, for instance, might demonstrate psychological safety through careful consideration of ideas rather than immediate vocal participation, highlighting the importance of cultural awareness when assessing progress towards psychological safety on your teams. Leaders play a key role in establishing psychological safety. Leadership strategies that emphasize openness and inclusivity can lead to higher levels of team engagement and satisfaction, as noted in research from MIT. From a psychological standpoint, leaders shape psychological safety through what social learning theorists call behavioral modeling. Team members look to leaders to understand what behaviors are truly valued versus merely espoused. Basically, they want to do what you do, not what you say. This creates what we call a climate of psychological safety, the shared perception of how safe it is to take interpersonal risks in a particular context. The neuroscience here is fascinating. Leaders who demonstrate vulnerability activate mirror neurons in their team members, facilitating empathetic responses and making vulnerability contagious in a positive way. However, leaders must also learn to navigate authority bias, our tendency to overvalue the opinions of authority figures. This bias can create false psychological safety, where team members appear to agree in front of the boss, but internally harbor doubts or concerns. Effective leaders counter this by explicitly rewarding dissent and demonstrating intellectual humility, openly acknowledging the limits of their knowledge and changing their minds when presented with new information, and being willing to say, "I don't know, let's find out together." Hybrid teams face unique challenges in building psychological safety without consistent physical presence. Research from the University of California shows that regular structured virtual meetings and clear communication are pivotal in fostering trust and psychological safety. From a psychological perspective, Hybrid work arrangements disrupt our evolved mechanisms for establishing trust. Human trust formation, especially for neurotypical individuals, relies heavily on nonverbal cues, microexpressions, body language, and proximity, many of which are harder to perceive in virtual interactions. This triggers attribution uncertainty in some people where the lack of contextual information leads them to fill in gaps with assumptions, and often negative ones. Neurotypicals could learn quite a bit from their neurodiverse and disabled colleagues about improved communication styles and inclusive communication customs that can help them adjust to diminished social cues. What's even more challenging is the way hybrid work creates information asymmetry, where in-office workers have access to informal conversations and environmental cues that remote workers don't. This creates a psychological effect known as ambient awareness deficit among remote workers, who may feel perpetually out of the loop. But it also contributes to continuing bad management habits that often devolve to who is closer rather than who is better for the project or the opportunity. To counter this, organizations can apply insights from social presence theory, deliberately creating structured opportunities for weak tie interactions, those casual encounters that build background trust in traditional offices. This includes practices like virtual coffee chats or digital water cooler meetings that leverage our psychological need for low-stakes social connection. For fully remote teams, creating a sense of psychological safety can hinge on digital communication norms. Studies suggest that encouraging regular, informal interactions can help remote teams feel more connected and secure. The psychology of remote work introduces unique challenges to psychological safety. Without physical co-presence, we lose access to what sociologists call co-regulation, that unconscious process by which some humans regulate each other's emotional state through proximity. This absence can lead to affective flattening, where emotional connections within teams become diminished over time. Psychologically, this manifests in several ways. The mere exposure effect, our tendency to prefer things we're frequently exposed to, works against remote teams who rarely see each other. Additionally, psychological distance increases, making colleagues feel conceptually farther away, which can reduce empathy and perspective taking. Some forward-thinking remote companies are countering these effects by implementing practices based on attachment theory, creating regular, reliable touchpoints that build secure attachment within teams. Others are using principles from chronopsychology, the study of psychological processes over time, to create synchronous moments that anchor team members' sense of connection despite physical separation. Effective tools for enhancing psychological safety can include anonymous feedback systems and regular team-building exercises, provided both have a good structure to prevent unconscious bias. Research from Stanford University emphasizes the importance of these tools in helping team members feel valued and heard. The psychology behind these tools is rooted in several cognitive principles. Anonymous feedback systems work by reducing evaluation apprehension, that anxiety that comes from knowing our contributions might be judged. This anxiety activates our brain's behavioral inhibition system, suppressing creative thinking and authentic expression. From a psychological perspective, effective team building isn't about forced fun, but about creating psychological contracts, the implicit understanding of mutual expectations and obligations. The most effective practices target psychological proximity, a feeling of closeness despite hierarchical or functional differences. Structured vulnerability exercises, like those developed by social psychologist Arthur Aaron, accelerate the development of psychological safety by creating sanctioned spaces for self-disclosure. Research shows these approaches work by activating the brain's oxytocin system, which promotes bonding and trust, creating neural pathways that associate team interactions with positive emotion. Psychological safety isn't experienced uniformly across different identity groups. Research shows that individuals from underrepresented groups often experience significantly lower levels of psychological safety, even in organizations that score highly on overall psychological safety metrics. This disparity can be understood through the lens of intersectionality, the psychological and social reality that individuals with multiple marginalized identities experience unique forms of exclusion that aren't simply the sum of separate discriminations. From a cognitive perspective, members of underrepresented groups often experience identity-based cognitive taxation, the mental resources consumed by navigating environments where aspects of their identity may trigger stereotype threat or bias. This taxation depletes the same cognitive resources needed for optimal performance, creating a double burden. Cultural dimensions profoundly influence how psychological safety manifests and is perceived. Geert Hofstede's research on cultural dimensions reveals that psychological safety practices that work in individualistic, low power distance cultures may be ineffective or even counterproductive in collectivist, high power distance cultures. For example, direct feedback approaches that enhance psychological safety in Western contexts may damage it in cultures where saving face is paramount. This cultural nuance extends to communication styles. Research in cross-cultural psychology shows that high-context cultures rely heavily on implicit communication and relationship context, while low-context cultures privilege explicit verbal communication. These differences create potential friction points where psychological safety can break down across cultural lines. Creating culturally inclusive psychological safety requires cultural humility, having an openness to learning about others' cultural frameworks without presuming expertise. Organizations at the forefront of this work are implementing cultural safety practices, a concept originating in healthcare that acknowledges power imbalances and aims to minimize them through systemic approaches. Psychologically, this works by reducing what sociologists call cultural imposition, that unconscious assumption that one's own cultural norms are universal and superior. Leading organizations now incorporate cultural intelligence training focused on developing the psychological flexibility to adapt safety practices to diverse cultural contexts. The impact of psychological safety extends to performance metrics such as creativity, productivity, and retention. A comprehensive review in the Academy of Management Journal links high psychological safety with improved job performance and employee well-being. The psychological mechanisms explaining this connection are multifaceted. First, psychological safety reduces defensive processing, the mental resources devoted to protecting ourselves from social threats. When these resources are freed up, they become available for task-focused work, explaining the productivity gains. For creativity specifically, psychological safety enables divergent thinking, the exploration of multiple possible solutions, rather than convergence on one obvious one. This process requires vulnerability, as many ideas will inevitably be rejected. Without psychological safety, people default to loss aversion, sticking with their safe ideas to avoid the social pain of rejection. The performance effects are especially pronounced for complex interdependent work. Neuroimaging studies show that psychological safety activates brain regions associated with exploratory behavior and dampens activity in regions associated with threat monitoring, creating an ideal neural environment for innovation and collaboration. If you've ever survived an acquisition, a restructuring, an IPO, or a similar transformation at your company, then you already know that periods of organizational change present particular challenges for maintaining psychological safety. Research from the field of change management psychology indicates that during transitions, employees' sense of psychological safety can decrease by up to 30%, even when the change is ostensibly positive. This vulnerability can be explained through the lens of uncertainty management theory, which posits that humans have a fundamental need for predictability. From a neurological perspective, uncertainty triggers the brain's threat response system, releasing cortisol and activating the amygdala, that same fight or flight response that makes creative thinking and vulnerability nearly impossible. What's interesting is that this neurological response occurs regardless of whether the change is perceived as positive or negative. It's the uncertainty itself that triggers the threat response. Organizations can counteract these effects by applying principles from transitional psychology. This field studies how people navigate significant life transitions and has identified key psychological resources that help people maintain equilibrium during change. Chief among these is sense-making, the cognitive process of creating meaning from ambiguous situations. Leaders who facilitate collective sense-making during change through structured dialogue and transparent communication about both the knowns and the unknowns help maintain the cognitive safety needed for people to process change constructively rather than defensively. The most effective approaches combine elements of narrative psychology, helping people construct coherent stories about the change that preserve their sense of identity and efficacy, with practical scaffolding that creates islands of certainty amid a sea of change. Research indicates that personal politics can significantly affect workplace dynamics. A study from Yale suggests that political alignment can influence trust and collaboration among team members, affecting overall team effectiveness. From a social identity theory perspective, this makes sense. We naturally categorize ourselves and others into in-groups and out-groups, with political affiliations serving as powerful identity markers. When political differences become salient in the workplace, they can trigger our tribal instincts, activating unconscious biases and attribution errors. We tend to attribute positive intentions to those who share our political views, something called fundamental attribution bias, while being more suspicious of those who don't. What's especially interesting from a psychological standpoint is that political polarization affects our perception of competence. Research from the Pew Research Center shows that Americans increasingly believe that those with opposing political views are not just wrong, but less intelligent. In workplace contexts, this can undermine psychological safety by creating environments where people feel their competence is judged based on their political beliefs, rather than their actual contributions. To counteract this, some organizations are implementing structured debate protocols like those developed by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, which focus on evaluating ideas based on merit rather than source. When companies take political stands, it can either strengthen the team spirit or lead to division. According to a paper published in the Journal of Business Ethics, clear communication about corporate political engagement is key to maintaining an inclusive environment. The psychological impact of corporate political endorsements operates through value congruence, the alignment between individual and organizational values. When employees perceive their values align with their organization's political stances, it enhances their organizational identification and their commitment. Conversely, value incongruence can trigger moral distress, discomfort that arises when your personal values conflict with an organization's practice. This phenomenon has neurological underpinnings as well. fMRI studies have shown that when people encounter information that aligns with their political beliefs, it activates their brain's reward centers, while contradictory information activates regions associated with negative emotions and pain processing. For organizations, this means that political endorsements aren't just external marketing decisions, but internal psychological interventions that impact employee well-being and cohesion. Progressive organizations are increasingly recognizing this by creating dialogue spaces where employees can process their reaction to corporate political stances without fear of retribution, while more conservative or authoritarian workspaces are choosing to suppress dissent rather than to address the issues. Continually improving psychological safety requires commitment to regular assessment and adaptation. Implementing regular feedback loops and training programs can help organizations stay responsive to employees' needs. The psychology of sustainable change suggests that improving psychological safety isn't a one-time intervention, but rather a process requiring what learning theorists call spaced repetition, regular reinforcement over time. This works because of how our brains form habits through neuroplasticity, the creation of new neural pathways through repeated experience. What many organizations miss is the importance of psychological measurement validity. Generic engagement surveys often fail to capture the nuanced dimensions of psychological safety. Advanced approaches use context-specific measures based on situated cognition, the understanding that psychological states are embedded in specific contexts. Some organizations are now implementing real-time psychological safety monitoring using natural language processing to analyze communication patterns, identifying early warning signs of declining safety. This approach leverages insights from psycholinguistics, the study of how language reflects psychological states, to create more responsive interventions before problems become entrenched. However, introducing AI into this process requires disclosure to the employees, or you undermine the trust required to build psychological safety on your team. Understanding and improving psychological safety in your workplace can lead to more innovative, engaged, and satisfied teams. It's important to consider how you can foster an environment where everyone feels safe to express themselves and to innovate. Remember that psychological safety isn't just an organizational nicety. It's a fundamental human need grounded in our evolved psychology and a major contributor toward a more sustainable and profitable business. Our brains are exquisitely tuned to social threat and reward, and psychological safety works by shifting this balance toward reward and away from threat. The resulting state isn't just pleasant, it's transformative, enabling levels of collaboration and creativity that simply aren't possible in fear-based environments. As you move through your work week, I invite you to notice the moments when you feel psychologically safe versus threatened at work, and consider how these states affect your thinking and your performance. And if you're in a leadership position, remember that your behavior sets the emotional tone for your entire team. By modeling vulnerability, curiosity, and respect, you're not just changing the culture, you're changing brain states, enabling your team to access their full creative and cognitive potential. Thanks for joining me on Cyberspace. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, signing off. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode.